Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can sign up on our homepage for all of our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. You can check out our show page and all of Safe Camp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web, at Safe Camp Audio on all social media. Alrighty, first Monday of the month, I think we will be doing Headlines Week for the podcast on that first Monday every month. We'll see. We'll run through recent coverage in the Imprint, stuff from elsewhere, research news, what have you. Really anything I can think of that people will find interesting. Before we get into it for this week, I want to promote a few things we got coming here on the audio front. First off, and you'll hear a little promo about this later in the episode, but coming Monday, February 26th, Fostering Media Connections, which publishes the Imprint, will be releasing the first episode of Interviews, a monthly show from our Youth Voices Rising program. So that will be on our podcast network, Safe Camp Audio, and we'll also be featuring those episodes on this feed, on the Imprint Weekly Podcast feed, at the end of each month. So what I'm aiming for here, first Monday of the month, we'll do kind of a headline wrap-up episode. Then you'll get some guest interviews. And then for a while now, at least the last Monday of the month, you're going to get the Interviews podcast on this feed. And you can also go and sign up for it, independently as well. So that first installment will be February 26th. Listen to the promo from our Youth Voices Rising director, Ivory Bennett, who will be in control of that podcast coming up in this episode. But that is actually not the only youth-run podcast that is coming soon to Safe Camp Audio. We have a new member podcast, and that is Self-Taught, the podcast, which is done by the Reproductive Health Equity Project and features unfiltered conversations about sex, health, and life. It is hosted by foster youth, for foster youth, and the people in their lives. So the folks at Self-Taught have already produced a season 1. We are going to kind of backload that one into the Safe Camp Audio show page for them, and then the second season will be coming out very shortly. I think they're going to do it on February 12th, but as soon as it is, we'll be helping to proliferate that on the Safe Camp Audio Network. Shout out in particular on the Self-Taught podcast. I just found out that Tamar Sebesta, who was a former Fostering Media Connections intern, so she's part of the FMC family for life. We have all known that she was going to be a star in the future, and I'm sure hosting this podcast is going to be just one more baby step on the way there. So congrats to Tamar. Last thing I'm going to shill for here, staying on the Youth Voices front, on February 29th, our Youth Voices Rising team will be hosting an online conversation called Who Am I? Ivory Bennett will moderate as this diverse group discusses the intersectionality of identities, offering firsthand perspectives to increase accessibility, destigmatize various markers, and guide practitioners in enhancing their approaches. So whether you're a practitioner, an educator, a policymaker, or you're just interested in contributing to a more inclusive child welfare system, this panel invites you to join the discussion and celebrate diverse voices. I will drop a link in the show notes where you can register for that one. Again, it is on February 29th, and that will be completely free. So I'll drop that registration in there for you. All right, so let's get to some headlines for this month. A few years ago, the Imprint reported on the establishment of an organization called the Family Justice Law Center. It was a new organization established in New York, and it sort of billed itself as, and I'm quoting here, the first civil rights organization in America dedicated to suing children's services and other government agencies that illegally separate children from their parents. And of course, there are, actually quite a few nonprofit litigation firms that do sue children's services. Largely, those organizations have focused on class action litigation that gets at the conditions of foster care, gets at the treatment of youth, less so on the practices of children's services around interactions with parents. At the time when we were reporting this, which I think was March of 22, that they announced this, the sort of founding director who's still there with the Family Justice Law Center, David Schellek Klein, said, and I'm quoting from our coverage, "We think that we'll go a long way to keep children safe while not having the government interfere unnecessarily in the most sacred relationship." And of course, he was referring there to the parent-child relationship. And so I mentioned this story from a few years back because the Family Justice Law Center just recently launched, I think it was in mid-December, their first litigation since starting a couple of years back. And this case that they have gotten into the appeals process on involves a New York City mother who's identified just as Miss W in court documents. She was physically abused by her daughter's father in front of the child. In some court filings, she described being called a snitch and being stupid, being slapped and hit. The child's father is also alleged to have, ripped dreadlocks out of her hair. And the New York City Child Protection Agency was notified of the domestic abuse from the mom's therapist, who she had confided in after telling him to leave for good. Okay, so what's happening in the case in general is that, there's an ongoing, I believe it's still ongoing trial in Brooklyn Family Court where the father is the kind of respondent since he was accused of the maltreatment. But the judge in the case has also confirmed that the mother was not accused of anything and is able to care for her daughter. But in order to retain custody of her child, Miss W had to agree to CPS supervision. So city investigators would, under that, agreement, have pretty much unfettered access to her home, would be able to visit, without restrictions on sort of time or scope. And the lawyers in this case in the Family Justice Law Center have pushed back. Oral arguments against this court order will likely be heard in the appeals court early next year. So this will be, the first test of this new civil rights-oriented child welfare litigation firm. And, the Imprint will stay on top of that to see first what the oral arguments surface and what comes out of it. I think this is obviously, a very fraught and important issue within child welfare that they're taking on with this first case, which is to what extent is a CPS agency really able to take any sort of, assertive or forceful position against a victim of domestic violence, in particular, after they've pretty much conceded in the case that person is fully able to, take care of and provide safety for the child. All right, I'm going to draw in a couple of headlines here, of a similar piece, because I think they all speak to kind of two different aspects of the same issue, and that is the nexus between adult drug use and child welfare and involvement in child safety. Our own Jeremy Loudenbeck wrote about two different actions out in the western states in January. One in California was a big Supreme Court decision to strike down California's tender years doctrine, which is sort of a legal standard that has long permitted the courts there to more easily remove kids who are under the age of 6 from a home due to parental substance use. So there's basically the line that it draws of the difference here is that with cases involving older kids, a child welfare agency has to go to court and prove that a parent's drug use presents a safety risk to the child. This is in California. I think there's certainly states where the laws are much more hazy. So this is kind of a refinement of a state that actually has some guardrails up, I guess, at that point. But the tender years doctrine sort of held very young children out of that, eased the process. Supreme Court is rolling that back. Basically, now everybody is on that same standard for any child. Child welfare has to go in and prove that a parent's drug use presents a safety risk. All right, and in the same piece, Loudenbeck reports on a piece of state legislation up in Washington state. It was introduced by State Senator Claire Wilson that would instruct courts during a foster care removal hearing to, quote, give great weight, end quote, to the presence of drugs like fentanyl and synthetic opioids in a home. So it would also create a new guidance and a risk assessment tool for child welfare workers weighing child safety in those cases where there was the presence of fentanyl and these synthetic opioids. And in defending the legislation and the driving force behind it, Wilson has cited to the Senate Human Services Committee up there. So just a little bit of additional context to the side of that I think is relevant. A rising number of poisonings and deaths of toddlers who have ingested fentanyl as what she describes as a, quote, unique threat that we've never experienced before. We're overwhelmed right now by the magnitude of the opioid crisis. That was Wilson talking fairly recently. The federal government put out their annual child maltreatment report. This covers fiscal 2022. That report shows, and I think we've talked about this on the podcast. I'll drop a link in just in case I am completely misremembering that, but they put it up, then they took it out for a little while, and now it's back up again. But top line, the number of confirmed victims of child abuse and neglect is at a record low again this year, but the number of child fatalities from abuse and neglect that are documented in the federal report is up, and it's been up for, it's been steadily going up for 5 years now. I think in 2022, it was 1,990. I'm working off memory. I'm not looking at it here, but I think in 2018 or somewhere around there, it was around 1,930. No, sorry, that was for 2021. So it went up, from 1930 to 1990 in that last year. So each state in the child maltreatment report from the feds has an opportunity to kind of just, basically like provide some notes on what's been happening on all fronts of child maltreatment reporting. They have a space to comment on reporting practices, identification of victims, on fatalities. And Washington State, as far as I could tell, I kind of ripped through those, was the only one that really talked about a rise in child fatalities related to fentanyl in particular. I'm just going to read from that section because it's a pretty jarring section that they provide here. So this is quoting from Washington's comments in the federal child maltreatment report. In the fiscal year 21 data, fentanyl and opioid overdose ingestion deaths accounted for 0.08% of the child fatalities that year. In fiscal 2022, fentanyl and opioid overdose ingestion deaths accounted for 23% of the child fatalities. In 2021, 28% of the fatality and near fatalities that qualified for a review were the result of fentanyl and opioid overdose ingestion. In 2022, 44% of the fatality and near fatalities that qualified for a review were the result of fentanyl and opioid overdose ingestion. That is a really hard three things to say. Opioid overdose ingestion. And, I know that was a little laborious and repetitive, but I think both of those things are kind of important to know. The fatality number is very small in any one state related to abuse and neglect, but that's a very sharp rise when less than 1% of child fatalities were attributable to fentanyl ingestion in 2021. By 2022, it's accounting for 23%, 1 in 5 or more of the child fatalities that were documented. And then the larger group is certainly this fatality and near fatalities. Obviously, there are many more near fatalities than there are deaths. So in 21, they're saying that 28% of the reviews they did on those kids were the result of ingestion. And that, almost sort of doubled, not quite, but to 44% by 2022. I want to add one more story to the mix, actually, and that's Julie Solik's reporting from the Bay Area News Group on a similar topic. So in December, dozens of social workers in Santa Clara showed up at a Board of Supervisors meeting to voice their frustration with policies locally in the county that they said forced them to leave kids in dangerous situations with drug-using parents. And this meeting where the social worker showed up occurred after the third death in about a 6-month stretch where an infant had ingested fentanyl and died. So, the reason I pile all of those stories together and kind of describe them at once for you is I think that what jumps out to me is the Supreme Court's decision in California around the tender years doctrine, I think is symbolic or harkens to, the growing consensus that there's a need for child welfare policy to reflect that there is fundamentally a difference between a person who uses drugs generally in absolute terms and somebody whose behavior as a result of drug use is in some way endangering a child. And those are not concentric circles. At the same time, I definitely think that the other two stories speak to what I would say is a credible concern about the significant increased lethality of fentanyl and synthetic opioids as compared to other narcotics, and the danger that its mere presence in a home represents for the kids that are in that home. Put another way, just less rhetorical, if a kid gets his hands on a very small amount of fentanyl or somehow consumes it off a table or on the floor or whatever, the risk of death or overdose from that is significantly higher than other drugs that we've encountered along the way here, in history. And so I've seen that reflected. I read a lot of news from all over the country about child welfare. I have seen, at least anecdotally, in the news, a lot of coverage around ingestion deaths. I was wondering, as we were waiting for the 2022 maltreatment report, A, whether there'd be another increase in child fatalities, and B, if, you saw a lot of states attributing such an increase to ingestion deaths, especially from fentanyl. Now, Washington State was the only one that really called that out in 2022. I guess, it's going to be another year at least before we have more information on that. But it's certainly something that is a concern. And I think you can see from that, those social workers showing up and speaking out directly to a board of supervisors in that county, that this is something that definitely has people on the front lines of child welfare freaked out. All right, a few more Imprint stories I want to recommend, then we'll take a break and I'll do a couple other headlines afterwards. First one, Sarah Tiano reporting on the Justice Department calling for states to end the issuance of fines and fees as part of juvenile cases, or cases that originate and are finished up in juvenile court. Fines, obviously, are costs incurred as part of your punishment. Fees can mean everything from, court-appointed attorneys to paying for ankle monitors, or paying for even the cost of spending time in a juvenile hall or detention center. So I'll drop the link to this as well as all the other stories I'm talking about in our show notes if you want to take a read of that. But, this is what I would say is kind of like incremental steps from the Justice Department that are just getting slightly more forceful every time. And I'm sort of wondering what the next shoe to drop will be. The timeline is kind of this: April of 2023, Justice sent out a letter to states sort of just highlighting, suggesting potential constitutional questions around the practice of issuing these fines and fees in juvenile cases. Fast forward to later in 2023, they come out with a report, the Justice Department, on the practice of fines and fees. And this one was kind of just juvenile and adults. They highlighted, systems that have ended them or come up with alternative paths or matching cost processes to make it at least more equitable to income and things like that. And so now they're sending out this new letter calling for systems to stop it, at least with juveniles. So it could sort of come from, just saying there might be some constitutional questions to like, hey, here's what other people are doing. And now they're saying, just sort of asking or calling for people to stop it, so it just leaves you to wonder what the next step would be. I guess maybe the Office of Civil Rights at the Justice Department investigating the practice, maybe pulling out somebody in particular county or state that does it in some sort of egregious way. Or if this is just simply kind of priming the landscape in general so that some other entity could challenge the constitutionality of juvenile fines and fees in a specific case. This is complete speculation. I haven't even talked to attorneys or experts about it, just pointing out that it sort of seems like they're kind of slowly walking from, the most general of discussions about this up to something maybe a little bit more substantial. Okay, last story on the Imprint slate of late that I want to recommend is a very cool story from Alex Perez, our reporter in Minnesota, about a host home program that serves LGBTQIA youth who have experienced foster care. It's managed by an organization called Connect with a Q, so it's like CONNEQT, which does, some more traditional stuff, rapid rehousing, transition programs for youth. But as Ryan Berg, the program director, told Alex, this host home concept is more of a form of mutual aid, right? They're finding volunteer homes that'll get trained up and vetted, but they're really not providing a safe place to live like within the confines of grants and contracting and all that stuff. Just going to read a quick paragraph from Perez's story to kind of describe how it works. All host applicants must have an extra bedroom, provide reference, and pass through the interview stage. Once selected, they sign a waiver of liability as well as a contract with the youth, the terms of which are mutually agreed upon. Household standards like meals, chores, and basic rules vary depending on the home, but they are typically far less restrictive than foster care or a residential program like group homes and stuff like that. This is aimed at, basically teens from 16 up until young adults of 24. So kind of an interesting new approach, particularly for older youth who probably had a rough time of it in the more traditional foster care system. I'll drop a link to that one. And then we'll be back with some more headlines in just a moment.
Hey there, lovely listeners. Ivory Bennett here, and I am beyond thrilled to welcome you to Interviews, my podcast where I spill the tea on healing, holistic health, and all things tantalizing. Join me for anecdotes about my life and engaging conversations with friends and lived experts offering diverse perspectives. With 17 years of lived experience in foster care, this journey is a collective practice of vulnerability, growth, and resilience. Interviews isn't just about my solo adventures, it's a community-driven exploration of laughter, introspection, and a whole lot of fun. Get ready for real talk with real experiences. You can listen to Interviews on Safe Camp Audio, your go-to for content that speaks to your mind, heart, and soul. If you're ready for a podcast that's entertaining, insightful, and all about self-discovery, hit that subscribe button now. Interviews, where every episode is a celebration of growth and resilience. Subscribe and join the conversation. I can't wait to see you there.
All right, let's do a couple more headlines for you guys, then we'll call it a day. Some pretty good coverage in the Montana Free Press from reporter Mara Silvers about a pretty complicated child welfare case involving a trans youth in the state that has gotten conservatives in Montana mad at their own fairly conservative Republican governor, Greg Gianforte. It's got kind of an interesting path to that job. I'm working off of memory here, but I believe he was one of the wealthiest members of Congress. He ran for Congress after losing a governor bid in 2016. He's the guy, if you remember, who body slammed a reporter. Pretty sure I'm right about all this. And then he won a special election. And he was in the House for a while, and then he became governor. But all to say, conservatives in the state are mad at him. He's a conservative governor. And I think the subtext that travels outside of this story is just, the sort of blurry lines around parental rights when it comes to the issue of gender affirming care that I think is coming to a head, really, probably in a lot of states. So the story jumps in at this kind of current anger with Gianforte, but, it all makes more sense if you kind of just start at the beginning. So here's my attempt at a summary, and as always, link in the show notes if you want to go read this whole thing. So CPS gets 2 calls, both of them anonymous, saying that this teenager is depressed and suicidal. This happened this year, and said that this teen had been identifying as transgender, since 2021, and that they've decidedly not been supported by their parents. I think in this case, this child was living with their father and stepmom. So CPS responds, they find this concern justified, and they hospitalize the youth in Montana with agreement from the dad and stepmom. Now, a psychiatric bed opens up, but it's in Wyoming, and that kind of is a tangential thing that speaks to the problems that we're having with available space for mental health, both in the community and in, more residential settings. Couldn't find one in Montana. They had to find one in Wyoming. So this bed opens up, but now the parents won't agree to a psychiatric stay because this neighboring state, Wyoming, does not have laws prohibiting gender-affirming medical care for transgender youth. So since then, the parents have expressed their continued opposition to other medical providers, to lawyers or care providers supporting this teenager's social transitioning. It's what the story refers to it as, which, generally non-medical actions that include the adoption of different names or pronouns, cutting or growing out hair, wearing different clothing, this is a quote from, I think, the father that is in the Montana Free Press. Basically, what I think they're trying to force us into is letting our child socially transition, but we're not okay with that. We're not comfortable with that. And this teen is now living in foster care. The story doesn't really make clear where. Could be in a foster home or a group setting. I'm pretty sure back in Montana. And the parents are disputing the reunification plan and its details, which again are not spelled out in the story, but I'm guessing if they're disputing it, it's because the reunification plan has the goal of this teen coming home, and they're supporting the identity that the teen has chosen for themselves, at least in a social sense. And that's really kind of the crux of this story, and why it sort of speaks to a bigger coming discussion around gender affirming care and parental rights, is that now going backwards, from where things stand to the sort of original CPS involvement in this case, it's really two different things. So when it comes to moving this child to what could have been a appropriate psychiatric facility, given that, he was identified as being suicidal, this is a concern by the parents, whether it was founded or unfounded. It's kind of hard to tell whether or not, they had a legitimate concern that this was going to happen, but their concern was a medical one. They were worried that this teen was going to go away to a hospital, and then that state and that hospital and the system was going to allow, this teen to access actual medical care, hormone blockers, or, an actual surgery. Again, not really sure how well-founded that is. I think it takes a while for a situation where a young person or minor is identifying as transgender before doctors are willing to treat them and administer puberty blockers. But it is a medical concern. They were expressing a medical concern there. And I think there are a lot of people who feel that parents who otherwise are caring parents and have a legitimate concern about, the pursuit of medical treatments on behalf of their children, or surgeries on behalf of their children, should have the standing to be involved there. But going back a step, you have CPS coming in and seeing a situation where they've been told this is a child who is suicidal and very deeply depressed. They go and find that, and I'm making some assumptions here, but it does seem like they are attributing that to the environment that the family has created for this child at home by socially forbidding them to pursue, who it is that they think they are. So I think there's obviously a very big substantive difference between those two things. Like, can parents act in any way they want out of anger and frustration and, controlling a young person socially, even if they are becoming dangerously depressed? And should a parent have the right to intervene and prevent the administration, potential administration of medications or treatments on a child if they think their child is not ready or it's not appropriate for their child? Now, the conservatives that are mad at Gianforte are basically saying that, like, the state's kidnapped this kid and threw him, in another state. Ironically, I think there are a lot of people that are progressively want to reform child welfare that would agree that, yeah, it is kidnapping if you take a kid and just move him across state lines where he can't, have any contact with family. I do think this case is a little different. But anyway, all to say, I think that we're not done. There's certainly going to be more legislation introduced this year that will ban gender affirming care. I've said this on the podcast before. I think the worst thing about that trend is that there are probably other countries that are having a more reasoned debate about who gets some say in whether a transgender youth can move towards different aspects of treatment, and particularly medical care or surgery, and just banning outright the concept for anybody. And, this all started with Texas and Governor Greg Abbott, even before there was legislation, basically instructing his child welfare agency to treat the pursuit of gender affirming care, or some of it, as child abuse, and to, treat medical professionals with that in mind and treat parents with that in mind. And that on its face was just, just on one level, very hypocritical from a governor who was at the same time pursuing a parental rights amendment to his state's constitution. So parents' rights were paramount to Governor Abbott in every case, except for making the decision about gender affirming care on a case by case basis. Anyway, so I'll keep you posted on what all happens with this, and we'll be surely tracking the trends around gender affirming care legislation in this next legislative season, which is already well underway. All right, last thing for this week. I think next time we do a headline update, I'll get into the various, state and federal legislation stuff, because I got back from vacation and got dreadfully sick, so I feel like I'm not equipped to really kind of run it down. But there are some interesting things getting put out there. For this episode, I think I'll wrap up by trying to sum up the state of all things federal data when it comes to child welfare. So I mentioned the child maltreatment report earlier. And I cannot remember if we talked about this on the podcast before I left in December. Probably not, actually, now I'm thinking about it. But anyway, we put a story up about the child maltreatment. For some reason, it got taken down, and then it got put back up again. And as far as I can tell, and I haven't heard from anybody else that anything changed. I think they just put a press release out and re-released it. So that is up. I'll post a link to our story about it and to the direct report itself. But like I said, top line, the number of substantiated victims of abuse and neglect are down. They've been going down for years now and are at a recorded low, I think. I don't know if it's a record low, it's a recorded low as far as I can tell. And child fatalities have gone up for several years now. There's also a special section that sort of does some parsing of neglect claims and isolates sort of the amount of cases where there's multiple types of maltreatment at play. That's pretty cool, pretty interesting stuff. So again, I'll drop a link for anybody that wants to geek out and get into that. So that was the child maltreatment report. Now, the other thing that comes out every year from the feds is called AFCARS. That's Adoption and Foster Care Analysis and Reporting System. That's sort of an ongoing data collection through that where the states kind of convey numbers to the feds, and every year they kind of put out a top line report that's just sort of explaining, how many kids entered and exited foster care, how many are in at a point in time count, demographics, exit to what, exit to adoption, reunification, et cetera, et cetera. Still missing in action. And at this point, it is very late. Usually the AFCARS report comes out in the fall of the year after, right? So the next AFCARS report that comes out is going to cover fiscal year 2022. So it's kind of referred to as the 2022 numbers. That report, should have, just based on kind of more recent history, probably come out in November, and still no word. I have kind of heard I know a little bit from behind the scenes that sounds like the numbers are in from all these states. Like there is federal data from these states, but there might be a problem in aggregating this into like a national report because there's kind of new collection elements or new reporting elements. This is well above my comprehension of like data stuff that are making it really hard on states. So I guess we'll see when we see. I do think eventually they'll put out an AFCARS report. For what it's worth, I know we've talked about this on the podcast before, do our own kind of annual survey of states to get at, how many licensed foster homes they have. We ask each state to give us a point in time count for around March 31st of the year of how many youth are in foster care. So we have what is probably not as quality a process as what the feds do, but we have numbers for 2022 and 2023. And in both of them, the number of youth who are in foster care have continued to go down. So I think that's what most people are interested in is in, official federal data for 2022. Are we still seeing the number of kids in foster care going down? Because there was kind of a widespread acceptance, quickly once there was social isolation. Okay, after the pandemic, there's going to be less reporting. There's going to be less child welfare activity. So there's definitely going to be less entries into foster care. That'll probably bring the numbers down. And it did. It went down by a lot. But there was probably like a general expectation that the numbers would rebound and things would go back up again. That hasn't happened as far as, the numbers for 2021 have gone, and our figures, again, from the Imprint for our Who Cares project for 2022 and 23 also suggest that it continues to go down, but we'll see. And, while we're on AFCARS, also missing in action here is really any resolution to this seemingly never-ending squabble over how to rewrite the rules for capturing more information, more foster care data in the AFCARS report. I definitely won't belabor this right now, but the Obama administration kind of on their last month put out, finalized new rules for collecting foster care data that would have, dramatically increased what states had to report. It would have, for the first time, included hundreds and hundreds of elements around the Indian Child Welfare Act and compliance with that. It would have had, information about sexual orientation, gender, and identity. It would have had information about how many youth who enter an adoption re-enter foster care, school performance. I'm missing a few things that are pretty big in here, I'm sure. Anyway, Trump freezes that. Trump rolls that back. Trump introduces his own set of rules around foster care data collection that basically took Obama's and didn't add anything. It just took a lot away. And then that got thrown into that ended up in court. And the Biden administration, as far as I can tell, is still kind of like a defendant in that litigation, which is yet to be resolved. And, they've voiced their intent to rewrite the rules. If anybody knows where the heck this all sits, hit us up at tips@imprintnews.org, because there's just crickets. And, my fear is if anybody introduces a new rule at this point and starts the clock again, even if that rule holds up, we're talking about they'd probably give the states 2 years to prepare. So just think of it this way. If the Obama finalized rule from 2016 or 2017, had stood, they would have probably given 2 years. Maybe the COVID made it a little hinky, so they maybe give another year to get in line with kind of the new elements. We would have probably started to see a lot of that by 2021, 2022. I mean, we're talking now about 2028 before we start to see meaningful increases in the amount of information that are coming in through AFCARS. But anyway, we'll of course keep an eye on that. And yeah, hit me up if you know anything about where everything stands with that. So one other thing that has come out from the federal government lately is their sort of periodic child welfare outcomes analysis, which is kind of an interesting, dive if you are interested in sort of seeing how your state performs relative to the nation on actual sort of outcomes, right? So child maltreatment just really tells you kind of the top line of how many kids were referred to child welfare because somebody thought they were abused and neglect. How many did they confirm? AFCARS is about just how many kids are in the system broadly. The outcomes analysis is pegged more towards what the federal government goes and looks for in their child welfare, kind of their review of them for process stuff. And there's sort of 7 outcomes. There's reducing the recurrence of abuse and neglect, reducing the incidence of abuse and neglect while in foster care, increasing permanency for kids in foster care, and then reducing the time in foster care to reunification, time in foster care to adoption, placement stability, and then there's the 7th outcome that they monitor through this process is how many young kids, which I think is defined as 12 or younger, who are in group homes or institutions. So I'll drop a link to this for people to check out. Basically, you see these, they kind of spell out the top line trends on all of these. And then you can see it's kind of a hard chart to look at, but it kind of breaks all 50 states down with the percent change in each one. My recommendation is grab that chart from this thing and put it into Excel for your own sanity, because it's a lot easier to look at there. So the downside here is this one lags way behind. So this outcomes analysis takes you through 2016 through 2020, which is not useless, but it's definitely the rosiest way to paint it. It was we have a very good picture of how things were changing in terms of outcomes in the system in the lead up to the very weird years of the pandemic. I think of the stuff that's included here for the 2016 to 20 analysis, it's the movement towards reunification stuff that I think is most interesting and probably the most relevant to sort of what's going on in terms of child welfare reform today. So basically the two sort of specific outcomes that they're looking for within what I just referenced, like on reunification, is all of the reunifications that occur in a state, how many occur within 12 months. That's sort of like, it's a little bit arbitrary, but they're basically saying, how often are you able to reunify kids that you reunify within a year? And then the other thing they look at is of those kids who are reunified, how many end up back in foster care within a year. So the national median in 2020, in terms of how many children were reunified within 12 months, was 60.9%. And that is down, pretty significantly. It's down from about 66% in 2016. So that's just put kind of in a more simple way, the number of youth who are exiting to reunification within a 12-month time frame is going down. There are more kids who are reunifying after a longer period than 12 months than there were, in 2016. So there was a pretty marked change there. There really wasn't much of a change when it came to how many youth are reunified and then enter foster care within 12 months. I think that went up by 1.4% over that, because of a 5-year window. And this all occurs against a backdrop of generally exits to reunification going down for pretty much every year that AFCAR has existed. When they quantify how many youth exit to various outcomes, there were always more than 50% of the exits that occurred to reunification, which meant kids were going home back to their parents. Since 2017, I think that was the first year that it dropped below 50%. It's been down below 50%. It has not gone back up. And I think in the last two AFCAR's reports for, 2020 and 2021, the exits to reunification had dropped to 47%. So, again, the first time I think since the AFCAR's reports came out that it was below that. Anyway, check out the link if you want to go and sort of see these outcomes that are kind of represent how the federal government, looks at is our child welfare systems working in an effective way. And like I said, you're able to get into the weeds in terms of like percent change anyway on how your state is doing relative to the overall aggregate national numbers. All right, that is going to do it for this episode of the Imprint Weekly Podcast, which is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, and that is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or Safe Camp Audio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anchoco, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you'd consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you would consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is very easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow the Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @theimprintnews, and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org, and you can always email us at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.